Hello. Welcome to the Deep and Durable Learning Podcast. This is the show for anyone who's struggled with the superficiality and short half-life of what passes for education. I'm Mike Gray, and I'm transitioning from nearly 45 years as a professor in higher education into this role of podcast host. This show is not primarily about bemoaning the state of education. Instead, I'll offer a positive, practical vision of how your learning can become both deep and durable. Join me for today's podcast, Memorizing Irrelevant Stuff. This entire season, we've been talking about epistemology. So far, we've explored these kinds of questions. What does it mean to know something? What counts as evidence for knowing? And what's the difference between justifiable belief and mere opinion? Well, we're continuing that path of inquiry today by evaluating the diet that most of us are being fed educationally, a diet of content coverage. So how does an educational diet that, putting it mildly, is obsessed with content coverage imperil your goal of deep and durable learning? It might seem an implausible place to go, but I'm going to go to a philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, who wrote back in 1929, so coming up on 100 years ago. In an essay, he made a number of points, but here's one that we're going to center our introductory comments around. He says, "I am sure that one secret of a successful teacher is that he's formulated quite clearly in his mind what the pupil has got to know in precise fashion." Well, I would agree with Whitehead to this point, but he's got some qualifications. One is that this is a secret. It's a secret of a successful teacher. A successful teacher, we could say, is successful to the extent that the teacher's students are learning, that the teacher's presence, the teacher's curriculum, the teacher's approach is promoting lasting learning. Okay? So I'm sure, he says, that one secret of a successful teacher is that he has formulated quite clearly in his mind what the pupil has got to know in precise fashion. And I would maintain that there are very few teachers who, in fact, have formulated quite clearly in their minds what the pupil has got to know in precise fashion, or even in a less than precise fashion. The quote goes on, though. He then, that is this successful teacher, he then will cease from half-hearted attempts to worry his pupils with memorizing a lot of irrelevant stuff of inferior importance. Did you catch that? A successful teacher will cease from certain kinds of things. Cease because he's probably, or she, is already doing what they shouldn't do. And what's that? Well, worrying his pupils or her pupils with memorizing a lot of irrelevant stuff of inferior importance. Well, what makes it irrelevant? Well, irrelevant stuff is irrelevant because it's irrelevant to life. It's irrelevant to the circumstances of the student. It is effectively useless. irrelevant stuff of inferior importance. Inferior to what? Well, inferior to the alternative, which the successful teacher has some insight into. Inferior to an emphasis on powerful ideas and their applications in solving problems that people do and should care about. That's our starting point, and it's instructive that we're talking about a commentary from 1929 that Whitehead is counseling teachers to cease from half-hearted attempts to worry their pupils with memorizing a lot of irrelevant stuff of inferior importance. And the word memorizing there, I think, is being deployed because memorization can and often, in fact, usually is a substitute for understanding. And we'll say a little bit more about that later in today's podcast. You're probably not in doubt about the way I'm approaching this. I could say I'm discontented with content. Content is the way we often refer to what's in courses. And content is a really vague word that could mean any number of things. And the reason we use such a low value word that doesn't really convey with any precision what the course consists of is that we set a very low bar so that almost any conceivable curriculum would have to pass that bar. That is, there is content in this course, as opposed to no content. That would raise a lot of eyebrows. But the real question is, what is the content? And are you content with the content that your children are being exposed to, that your courses are based on, if you're a college student or high school student? It leaves unresolved that issue, but it's suspicious that we are content to use the word content, or sometimes subject matter. We can go even before 1929 to the Victorian era, and let me give you a quotation from Charles Dickens' book, Hard Times. It's actually on the very first page of the book, where we find a schoolmaster in Victorian England being confronted by his superior with this. The superior says to the schoolmaster, "Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. Plant nothing else and root out everything else. You can only form the minds of reasoning animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be of any service to them. Stick to the facts, sir." This is a parody, to be sure. But for a parody to work in a literary context, it has to have a basis in the experience of the reader to work. And this one, we could say, touches some nerves. So I'm quoting here from a paper written by a team of people in the United Kingdom. The first author on the piece is Colin Lancashire. And he uses a term that was used back in my era, even though Lancashire is writing in the year 2000. And that word is subjects. Faculty back then taught subjects. And your report card listed those subjects. The idea of a subject is, again, one of these non-committal terms. And Colin Lancashire and his associates make this comment about curriculum. They say throughout, and I'm quoting now, throughout the modern industrial era of print, learning has been based on curriculum subjects, organized as, here we go again, bodies of content, which are in turn based on work done in the disciplines. that is history, mathematics, natural science, and so on. And then they warmed to the subject. The primary object of learning was the content of subjects. The content of the subjects was something that was primary, that if you're going to be said to have learned, you're going to learn the content. What exactly is the content? And let me flip to an example that I'm living through right now. My wife and I happen to be this year, and we were last year as well, responsible for the preschool education of our grandson Joshua, who right now is 3.5 years old. He is immensely curious and hungering to know and to gain insight into the world around him. So we're not pushing him academically, but he pushes us most of the time, asking questions and usually follow-up questions if what we give him is not satisfying. As one avenue of his instruction, we have used and continue to use Khan Academy Kids, which is an app that I use on my phone.
Khan Academy Kids.
So let me say this about Khan Academy Kids. Kudos in many respects. I appreciate the way number and letter competence is being developed, which leads to the ability in the student to add and subtract, even at this young age, although those terms are not used, and to employing phonics as a tool for word mastery, as preparation for being able to sound out words, and eventually to read, which my wife and I are convinced will probably happen for our grandson by the time he's 4. So that's kudos. However, then there is the science curriculum. Oh my. If you've been listening to this podcast, you know I am a scientist. I was a university professor teaching microbiology for nearly 45 years in higher education. And here's the thing that I have noticed about the science curriculum. Basically, it is fact and vocabulary overload. Fact and vocabulary overload. It is an example of the way science has historically been taught to elementary school kids, which is to say, the tried and true method that burns out the curiosity of most of them rather quickly. So most of the science curriculum is short books that you can read if you're a reader, which my grandson is not yet, or you can have read to you at a brisk but not too brisk pace. So here's an example of the way science is taught by Khan Academy Kids with regard to the moon. So there's a short book on the moon, which probably takes less than 3 minutes for the narrator to read through, and you flip the pages, or they're flipped for you. And so you get pictures of the moon from a distance, close up, and so forth. But thinking of a 3.5-year-old, these are some of the things that you'd encounter in that 3 minutes, let's say. The moon is 239,000 miles from Earth. The moon takes 29.5 days to orbit the Earth. These are the phases of the moon, and it goes on to list them with the appropriate generally recognized scientific terms for phases of the moon. Then it talks about waxing of the moon through the phases and waning of the moon through the phases. It shows a picture of smooth plains on the surface of the moon and assures us that those are called Maria or Mariah. It shows us some other areas that are mountainous, and those are the highlands. It shows us craters and assures us that the largest one is more than 1,000 miles across, although there are many that are smaller. It introduces us to meteorites. It tells us the moon has no atmosphere. It tells us the moon is very hot, and then says it's 265 degrees Fahrenheit at times, and parts of it are very cold, like minus 310 Fahrenheit is mentioned. And then the final piece is a 2-page glossary with those 12 boldface words with detailed definitions, I assume for the parents to read because the narrator doesn't read them. But what is that? That's information overload. I submit to you that although these are supposed to be age appropriate for a 4-year-old, that most 4-year-olds don't have any real conception of what a mile is, much less 239,000 miles. They don't know what 29.5 means in reference to days. They probably struggle with the idea of an orbit, although my grandson, I think, knows the idea. And then there's all these terms that are new terms and introduced in a phrase or a sentence at the most, and then move on to some other vocabulary term. There's no sense in a 4-year-old of what we mean when we say no atmosphere. What in the world is 265 degrees Fahrenheit? How does that relate to room temperature? What is minus 310 Fahrenheit, and how does that relate to anything that the student has experienced? I suspect that they're putting these short books in place for a few different levels, probably starting with K4 and moving for several years. Lest you get the idea that this is perhaps an isolated example, here's one from the biology side of things. And it's from a short book about the same length as before, as for the moon, about seeing. And that's from a series of books on the senses, the 5 senses. So it starts off right out of the gate talking about light reflecting off of objects and the concept of color being related to the part of the spectrum that is reflected as opposed to the part that is absorbed. They move on and talk about the eyeball, which is, of course, what perceives the light and the color. And they talk about the cornea and the pupil and the iris and the lens and focus and the retina and rods and cones in the retina and the optic nerve and the tie-in of the optic nerve with the brain, and then finally the image that we see as a result of processing in the brain. And we're left at the end with a glossary with 13 bold-faced terms along with longer definitions. And again, I submit to you, that's vocabulary overload. I'm reminded of my oldest when she was a first grader. And I was, of course, a first-time parent of a first grader. And she came home from school, and my wife said, she has something she wants to tell you. And I said, great. And she said, "Daddy, I can spell photosynthesis." And she proceeded to do so very rapidly. And I said, "That's great." And then I asked a fatal question. I said, "What is photosynthesis?" And there was a look of shock on her face, and she started crying. Well, I've learned better over the years about what's age appropriate, but this is the very thing that's being promoted in curricula that the Khan Academy for Kids is using for science. And let me say, this is not an isolated example. I suspect if you have children, you can go to their textbooks and look at the plethora of vocabulary that is present in their textbooks. It's true also of first-year college biology, and some studies have been done that show students in a first-year college biology actually encounter more new vocabulary in their biology course than they would if they were taking a first-year college-level language course. The difference being, of course, that the vocabulary is part of the professional jargon that we just assume they can pick up on the fly as we're using it in the service of presenting content. If we go back to learning and subjects for a minute, the objective has always been higher in principle than just remembering content. Colin Lancashire and his colleagues in the UK make this additional comment about curriculum, that earlier, you remember, Lancashire and company said the primary object of learning was the content of the subjects. Well, here he says, school learning, and I'm quoting here, has also been based, but not primary, also been based on the idea that by participating in curriculum subjects derived from the disciplines, learners could come to see how this content gets discovered and justified by experts, in addition to learning about the content itself. So supposedly although the primary emphasis is on the content, they can, on their own, come to see how this content gets discovered and justified by experts. Carl Wyman, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics and is extremely active in particularly college level, but to some extent high school level science teaching, says that a traditional science instructor concentrates on teaching factual knowledge. I'm quoting him here. So that's what he concentrates on, just like Lancashire and company indicated. Concentrating on teaching factual knowledge, content in other words, with the implicit assumption that expert-like ways of thinking about the subject come along for free. Bad assumption. And Colin Lancashire and his associates admit it is another matter, quoting here, as to how far this integration of subject matter and seeing how experts discover and justify the content, so-called, it is another matter as to how far this ever actually occurred in practice within schools. Indeed. So there's lip service to the ideal that we're developing knowers, idea that we're transmitting knowledge, so-called, actually information, is what's actually happening. But there's lip service to that objective because everybody feels like that ought to be happening in the school. But in fact, the curriculum works against engagement and deep learning. An important observation was made back in 2005 by Daniel Schneck, who at that time was on the engineering faculty at Virginia Tech. And what he said is that students were being expected to do inductive logic on their own. Inductive logic on their own. What he said, let me quote him here, is, "We, the teachers, provide students only with the structure, getting immediately into the nitty-gritty details. The emphasis is not on stepping back to look at the whole picture, the entire jigsaw puzzle. Such an educational system puts the burden on the student to integrate all of the isolated course material and to work backwards inductively, going from specific to the general in order to assemble the whole jigsaw puzzle from all its individual pieces. And I would observe induction is far more difficult than deduction. And yet we're leaving the hardest piece for the students instead of intentionally directing them in how to integrate what we're teaching, the ideas, not just the facts, that we're teaching within a larger context from which they can then make additional connections. A commentator, Henri Poincaré, put it this way: science is built of facts the way a house is built of bricks, but an accumulation of facts is no more science than a pile of bricks is a house. So as we move toward the close here, you ask the question, what can a learner do? What can you do? What can you help your student do to rise above the information fixation of current curricula, including most curricula in college? Well, you have to have a higher goal than the goal that you get grades for. You have to do in reality what lip service is only played to. And this is historically what a liberal arts curriculum in college is supposed to do. William de Resserich in Excellent Sheep said, because of a liberal arts curriculum, you are, and now I'm quoting, you learn how knowledge is created. And my brackets are, I hope so. You don't just acquire information, you debate it. How do we know it's true? What further questions does it raise? You learn, in other words, that there is no information, strictly speaking. There are only arguments. Only arguments. We're referring back to what we talked about in the previous podcast, which is justified true belief. There are arguments when you debate the information you're exposed to, when you attempt justification or you attempt to rebut something that's given as factual information. The other thing we could say is that as a learner or the parent of a learner, you need to emphasize ideas first and de-emphasize jargon. The jargon may become important, particularly for grading, because grading is notoriously based on the ability to recall and use the words with memorized definitions. But the reality captured it really in a 2016 paper called Concepts First, Jargon Second. This is how understanding is promoted. You wrestle with ideas, and the jargon comes later as a fine-tuning of the way you express those ideas and their interrelationship. So why would it matter? It would matter because information leads to memorization of information, leads to reproducing the information. That's inert information. It matters because concepts are ideas and not just facts. So in closing, let me give a shout out to another children's program that my grandson actually pointed out to me. My 3.5-year-old grandson is a big fan of Wildcrats.
Wildcrats! We're here in North America, in a habitat called the Northeastern Temperate Forest. It's us, the Krat Brothers. I'm Chris. I'm Martin. You might not see everybody all the time, but this temperate forest is teeming with life.
A shout out to Wildcrats for orienting each episode around answering questions, which is what scientists do. In a Wildcrats episode, they're solving a problem. They're engaging in cause-effect explanations. The explanations are part of a larger narrative that everything fits logically within. We watched an episode together this morning. In that episode, they were working on the concept of a balanced ecosystem and how it became unbalanced after an invasive species, Chinese beetle, was imported with some wood probably into the United States and started to invade our forests. Complex ideas, but my grandson was absolutely riveted by the presentation, by the ideas that were there. There was a subset inside there because one of the ways of controlling this invasive species of beetle could be woodpecker appetites. So they spent some time talking about the way the woodpecker is designed to anchor itself to the tree while it's pecking away and to absorb the shock that it receives from pecking on the tree. So does that just rivet his attention, or does he actually learn? Well, one of the things that came up later when he was in Khan Academy Kids was he was looking at something about insects, and he says, "Where's the fireflies?" Well, there weren't any, but that reminded him of a previous Wildcrats episode, and he said, "Fireflies glow, their tummies glow, but their tummies don't hurt because they produce cold light," was his take, which is bioluminescence. That was 3 weeks ago when that Wildcrats episode was viewed by him, and he still knows it, and he still can explain why it's significant, at least to a firefly who doesn't need to have a fire in his tummy to produce light. So, where are we? Well, a fixation on information leads to mental overload, and after mental overload typically comes boredom. If the rigor in education is in the form of information overload, then memorization is the coping strategy, and understanding takes a distant second place. So rigor in the form of information overload promotes memorization, not understanding. This approach then doesn't teach the student how to think, only what to remember. This approach assumes that the ability to be reflective, who has time for that, and to integrate facts into a larger, coherent framework happens spontaneously. And you know, and I know, it doesn't happen spontaneously. It involves a serious degree of intentionality. Join me in 2 weeks when we'll consider who needs experts. In our time, the distinction between expert judgment and the uninformed opinion of the novice has all but been obliterated. Isaac Asimov said, "The false notion that democracy means my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge." Go to my website, deepanddurable.com, where you'll find additional resources, including being able to view my blogs which are always produced parallel to and complementary to these podcasts. Take a moment to like this podcast and to rate and review it. This will help others find this empowering resource.